It is great to welcome to the program today Heidi Boghosian, who's a New York City-based attorney and author whose latest book is I Have Nothing to Hide and 20 Other Myths About Surveillance and Privacy. It's really great having you on. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
So let's start historically a little bit if we can. Was there sort of a surveillance state before 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the bulk surveillance that we've learned about over the last decade or so? What was there an apparatus that predated that, and to what extent?
There has always been a surveillance apparatus in the United States, and the justification for it remains the same. It's largely based on the government's theory that we need to be monitored to protect national security. And I think what we've seen with the events of 9/11, but also as the digital age has really taken over our lives, we've seen that surveillance apparatus on steroids in effect. And the ways that we can be monitored are just about as many as one can imagine. And we're seeing so many levels of creativity to do that, from spying on children to just invading all aspects of our daily lives.
Let's talk about some of the methods, I guess, because people may not be familiar with all of them. I think metadata is a term that many more people now are familiar with maybe than they used to be, in this concept of, well, even without the content of a phone call, a list of the numbers you've interacted with can be very revealing and invasive when it comes to observing your activities. But can you talk a little bit about the breadth of these techniques and technologies that are in place?
An easy way to look at the extent to which we are monitored is to think of the gold rush of the early days of this nation. We're in a data rush right now, and data represents essentially the crude oil that fuels our digital economy. So every time you log on, we have data aggregators, which is more than a $200 billion business in this country. So if you think of it as your personal information is like nuggets of gold that others want to reap, collect as much as they can, essentially without the laws, sort of like the property laws that didn't exist when we had the early gold rush, our legislators have not kept up with tech advances, so that Facebook, for example, just announced that it was putting the pause on developing an Instagram type app for kids,
Right.
uh, which really habituates not only young kids to become loyal users of that app, but it allows third parties to gather personal information. It may be just what sites they visit, what preferences they have when they purchase something online or when they ask their parents to buy something. Each of those kernels, when put together, can give a really accurate profile of our lives. And you mentioned metadata. Well, metadata is defined very loosely as information about information. So it's sort of when a photo might have been taken, it's kind of embedded in all of the documents that we get online. That, when captured in large quantities and having algorithms applied to search for patterns in that, can really tell a lot about who we are. For example, if I went to a cancer doctor 5 times in 1 week, or an abortion provider, that information is then sold to others, including government agencies, but largely marketers and for-profit entities, who then design ads to target us to buy more of a similar product, or to send us ads about cancer treatments and medications. The problem is when you get faulty algorithms, as we so often do, and one example was drone strikes that this country launched in Afghanistan and other countries from 2006 on. There were flawed algorithms, which means that in that case, there were lethal consequences. People who really shouldn't have been on a terrorist watch list, for example, may have been killed in drone strikes, innocent individuals.
Right. There's kind of two layers on which we could talk about the security aspect of the surveillance state. One would be, does it make us, quote, safer? And if it did, we could then have a debate about the trade-offs and whether that's worthwhile. So maybe we can start with the first piece. Do we know that these techniques put in place starting around 9/11 and going forward, does this increase safety in any measurable way?
There's been no evidence to prove that it does increase safety. And that's really a tragedy because I think millions of Americans may think they're doing the right thing by saying, I have nothing to hide, you can have my data. But I think it was the Navy War College issued a report years ago saying that they had analyzed so-called threats of terrorists and found that the measures put in place after 9/11, which really cut back on a lot of our liberties and certain constitutional rights that we take for granted, they found no evidence that it made us safer in any instance. And I think the problem is most people don't know that. It's not publicized because in addition to bolstering the claim that it does make us safer, what it ultimately does is hand over information that gives more control to those in charge. And that means less autonomy in our personal lives and more control by others.
Now, let's talk about I have nothing to hide, maybe a little bit. A few years ago, I mean, that seemed pretty reasonable to me. You know, my feeling was, yeah, I get that there may be people who know more about me than I would willingly give up, but I don't have any particular reason to worry about this because I don't have anything to hide. And then I read about overcriminalization, about how sometimes you may not think you have anything to hide, but you may inadvertently have done something or interacted with someone who does maybe have something to hide. And then all of the other pernicious ways in which this can be used. What's the best sort of argument against that idea of, I really don't care, I don't have anything to hide?
I think a fundamental argument against that is that people need to realize the importance that privacy has played in this society. For example, during the AIDS epidemic, a lot of healthcare providers, hotlines, realized that in order to help quell the spread of HIV, they would need to offer anonymous reporting or anonymous testing. And that's true in so many other segments. So, for example, a woman who has been the victim of spousal abuse has to know if she's going to come forward to seek help, that she can do so anonymously or privately. And there are different levels of how you shield one's identity. But that pertains to whistleblowing in government, to encourage people to come forward when they see malfeasance in the institutions in which we put our trust. So I think you have to first start at privacy plays an essential part in society. And then you have to realize that if you're willing to hand over your entire life to the government, we do so because we trust the government. And I think, you know, that's a wonderful premise on which to base a democracy. But we have seen, in fact, that we cannot always trust our leaders, that self-interest or other factors may lead them to abuse our information, or very often just due to a casual mistake. My name may be confused with a similar name. I may be mixed up with someone who did commit a crime, for example, but because of the databases that all of our information is stored in contain so many errors, often just sloppy data entries, that there have been so many cases of people caught up in a crime that had nothing to do with their lives, and they were falsely prosecuted. It also shows that if the government doesn't like what you say, if you're a dissident or just an outspoken individual who criticizes a corporate policy, for example, or a government policy, they can target you and find just about any reason among the many antiquated laws that are on our books to go after you.
Yeah, I'm almost done reading this new book, The Perfect Police State, about China and the persecution of the Uyghur population. Is there a spectrum in the sense of it seems in terms of surveillance, China is very much on one end, What's on the other end, and where on that spectrum is the United States in your assessment?
That's an excellent question. We do look to China as an example of the extreme and what we as a purported democracy would never want to be, where, for example, I just have to say they have a system that is being used in some parts of China where you're under such constant surveillance that if you jaywalk, for example, or if you don't pick up after your dog, points are deducted.
Yes.
And that can, reflect the electricity you get, the access to social services. On the other extreme, and that's a great question because I can't really think of a nation. So many of our partners in the so-called Five Eyes, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, have sort of rings of surveillance everywhere. It's become the norm, and we're becoming conditioned to just accept that. But I would imagine there are probably countries in Scandinavia or countries maybe in Latin America, South America, where the technology in some of those countries may not be as sophisticated as what we have here with our robust economy. So I would imagine that in countries without that kind of surveillance accessibility, you don't have the digital surveillance we have here.
And so where is the US on this spectrum right now in your assessment?
I think the US is pretty high up there with England, for example, as basically having the equivalent of these, what we call rings of steel, the circles of surveillance cameras, closed circuit TV. But we have it built into our economy so that as simple as getting a cup of coffee may have a loyalty card where they track the numbers of coffees that you buy, but they also track more, your credit card number, which is linked to other data. I think that the US is in a race to perfect total information awareness, the collection, and with the entry of 5G, where more things will be even connected. And when they're internet connected, that provides near perfect access to our data.
I wonder, let me see how I can kind of frame this up. I wonder if there's a degree of inevitability to this because of the direction, not from a law enforcement standpoint, but from a sociocultural technology standpoint, if there's a degree of inevitability to some of this. And I'll give you like one example and then we can talk about it. The entire literature now around longevity and living longer, healthier lives and nanomedicine and customized medicine, it's mostly all premised on having much more data, not only about you as an individual, but data about how you compare to others and what sort of diet or supplements or treatments or whatever the case may be good for you specifically. There's really no way, it seems, to do this stuff without many more parties having access not only to our individual data, but to everybody's in some sense. And for the most part, I mean, in some kind of like general sense, a lot of that stuff sounds kind of interesting. Like it would be great to know what exact diet or what exact preventive treatment. So is there some inevitability to this that is going to be hard to restrict at all?
I think that's absolutely right. First, we have convenience. Then we have the kind of addictive quality that these devices have, and they're created in effect, just like video games, to be addictive.
Yeah.
But there are, as with all technology, so many positive benefits, as you mentioned. And I think the trick is harnessing those, but also having an educated public that is able to realize when they should have the option of saying, I don't wish to share that. And I think the problem that we're having and why I wrote this book sort of is a primer so people can get a sense of the different areas that we're impacted by is we need to first, our legislators have to be more educated about technology. They're woefully behind the advancements. And that's a problem because they can't craft laws that keep a pace with new technologies that are emerging daily
Right.
and new applications. So I think if we have a program where we educate kids the first time they learn to type on a keyboard, what the perils are and what the benefits are, and really develop a healthy course in school that parents also participate in digital hygiene. We would not, for example, let a stranger walk into our bedroom every night and use our toothbrush or just make themselves at home downstairs. And that's in effect what we're doing and what young kids are doing without that education. So I think you have to educate the public and our leaders to the degree that they are able to say, we need to build in privacy, for example, into our devices, or the software has to be better tested before it's put on the marketplace to ensure that adequate privacy protections are built into their infrastructure.
Last thing I want to touch on with you, if someone right now makes it a priority to prevent themselves from being tracked, watched, monitored, surveilled, etc. You Google this and you see things like turn off microphone access for your Facebook app on your phone, right? Very, very narrow and specific thing, all the way to don't use banks or credit cards, which for the average participant in the modern economy is not at all sort of practical. To what degree is it possible to really not be tracked right now, regardless of how aggressively you're willing to adopt these things, or to some degree, if you're sort of like living on the grid, it's quite difficult at this point in time?
It's super difficult. One would have to literally not use a credit card, stay off online searches.
Yeah.
And I think what's daunting to most people, and I get it, is that, encrypting, for those who are reporters or journalists who have to protect confidential sources, there are wonderful measures in place that they can use. It becomes more difficult for the average citizen to use all of those, but there are basic things like not using the same password over, changing it, using a sentence instead of your pet's name. There are basic things that aren't that hard, enabling two-factor authentication, for example, when you log into accounts. Keep down the number of apps that you have. They're really portals, unless they come directly from the manufacturer. Don't download things from online. There are measures you can take to reduce the amount of surveillance. I think it's unrealistic to say you can stop it entirely unless you go off the grid.
Yeah. Yeah. The book is I Have Nothing to Hide and 20 Other Myths About Surveillance and Privacy. We've been speaking with the book's author, New York City-based attorney Heidi Boghosian. Such a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, David.